It's coming to the end of the year now, and there have been a number of books that I've read this year that have truly stuck out to me as exceptional. So here they are. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. The Red and the Black by Stendhal. I actually originally read this as an ebook, but I liked it so much that I went out and got a physical copy, just because physical copies are a bit more pleasant to read. It's also one of the greatest psychological novels of all time, and I just really don't see people talk about it all that much, at least not online. It follows an extremely clever, socially climbing young man named Julien Sorel as he interacts with French society in the 1830s. I don't want to spoil it here because, unlike some of the others on this list, the plot is genuinely a huge part of its appeal. But the reason that I'm recommending it is because it explores a whole number of frustrations and ideas about love that are hugely relevant today. I actually wish that I read this before I'd written my video on love last year. Stendhal is, in my view, one of the most perceptive writers on the topic of romance ever. This comes out probably most straightforwardly in his book De l'amour, or On Love, which is a collection of his first-hand anecdotal observations about romantic and erotic love. But quite a lot of those insights are manifest in The Red and the Black, but in just a more entertaining narrative form. One of the truths about love and attraction that Stendhal explores, which I just don't see too many people talk about today, is that attraction isn't really up to you. We're often attracted to people for really quite strange reasons that are sometimes completely peculiar to us and might not make any sense to the people around us. Maybe that person fills some emotional need that we didn't even know we had. Maybe they feed into some unnurtured aspect of our identity. Perhaps we just love them simply because they seem to not love us, and we want to desperately prove to them that we are worthy of their love. Stendhal's characters often get caught in these frustrating cycles of attraction, and if, like myself, you too have ended up in deeply embarrassing situations in the pursuit of romance, then The Red and the Black will give you some ample material for reflecting upon that. I do plan to make a whole video about it at some point, but I really just would encourage you to read it firsthand. It's also just very funny. It's very well written. Stendhal is a great writer. I don't think that's too controversial to say. I also think that he is very underrated as a philosophical thinker. In some ways, I think of him like the Machiavelli or Thucydides of human relationships. His commitment to an empirically grounded view on love, displaying it with warts and all, is honestly kind of refreshing to see in a sea of idealistic narratives on display at the moment. At the same time, I don't think that Stendhal is ever unrealistically cynical either. He is astute and perceptive enough to capture both the highs and lows of romantic companionship, and I just really appreciate that in him. If you do need any more motivation to read Stendhal, his writings were actually the inspiration for the modern psychological theory of limerence, which is a kind of obsessive, quite unhealthy attraction that completely captures those who feel it. It was in the novels and writings of Stendhal that Dorothy Tennov found some of the germs for her now really quite influential psychological theory. I've often thought that most of us have just a touch of the limerent in us, even if we don't carry it to the same pathological extreme as the people that Tennov is talking about. And I do think that Stendhal can help us better understand this part of ourselves. Also, the really nice thing about The Red and the Black is that it is neatly split into two halves, and you can sort of read the first half as a semi-standalone novel if you want to. I don't know if this is sacrilege to admit, but I actually just much prefer the first half of the book, and while I have read the whole thing, I've actually reread the first half of it a couple of times over the course of this year because it's just that good. And if something is good enough to reread 3 times in a year, I think it's worth recommending. But before moving on, in addition to reading, there are other ways that we can learn things, which is why I recommend you check out today's sponsor, Brilliant. We all know that studying STEM subjects like maths, science, and programming can be quite tricky. These can get unintuitive rather quickly, which often does present a real challenge for students. But this is where Brilliant can come in handy. They have courses on a wide range of topics, from programming with functions to probability theory to learning the ins and outs of large language models or classical mechanics, and each one is crafted by award-winning research teams. Additionally, Brilliant's learning is based around completing exercises and activities, so you can learn by putting the ideas that you've picked up into practice, which both improves retention and just stops things getting dull. It can also reduce your social media doom scrolling, since with their app, you can complete lessons or exercises on the go rather than spending the afternoon getting involved in some pointless Twitter drama. If you want to improve your critical thinking skills, then you might want to check out the logic courses on Brilliant, which will let you see what logic is all about. And in my experience, with even a little bit of logic, the world suddenly becomes a whole lot clearer. A friend of mine also wanted to give his personal recommendation to their calculus puzzles, which he says are very fun. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/unsolicited advice or scan the QR code on screen, or you can click the link in the description. Brilliant's also giving my viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, so please do check that out. But anyway, back to the video. Next up, we have Michel de Montaigne's essays. De Montaigne was a French nobleman who did what almost every bookish nerd has wanted to do at some point. He shut himself up in a castle with a metric shit ton of books and wrote about basically whatever took his fancy for a decade and change. The result of this is a work that spans just an enormous number of topics, written by an absolute genius who does genuinely have something worthwhile to add to each of them. There's something for everyone in Montaigne's essays. For lovers of learning, there is his essay on the education of children. One of my favourite essays is one of his early psychological ones, where he argues that, psychologically speaking, we naturally seek to discharge our passions in nearby targets, and that if we don't do this, we get incredibly frustrated and may even turn these destructive passions inward and use them to gnaw away at ourselves. You can recognise in this the germ of Nietzsche's theory of drives turned inward, which would later be developed by Freud into his theory of repression. Look, I know that Nietzsche did read Montaigne, and I don't have any idea if this particular essay inspired his own psychological observations, but either way, I think it is a real mark of the prescience of Montaigne's thought, and it is worth noting that Nietzsche greatly admired Montaigne. Perhaps the thing that Montaigne is best known for today is his revival of Pyrrhonian skepticism, which was an ancient Greek school of philosophy that emphasized the doubt and fallibility of all human knowledge. This, in turn, made Montaigne one of the earliest proponents of limited religious tolerance, since he thought that we should be wary of thinking that our own religious beliefs are certain, since we are fallible human agents. He thought this despite being a very devout Catholic himself during the hot European wars of religion, so this alone makes him a very interesting thinker to read. The other reason that I love this book is that you can dip in and out of it pretty easily, and Montaigne writes in an incredibly entertaining and really quite witty way. I have my own copy of the essays on my coffee table and have had it there for the past few months, and it's just wonderful picking it up when I'm bored or procrastinating, reading an essay that's often like 10 to 20 pages and is also written really clearly, and is also incredibly interesting, and then I can just go back to whatever I was doing or whatever I was meant to be doing. The fact that Montaigne writes on so many different subjects and is so refreshingly anti-dogmatic means that you will almost always come away from reading one of his essays having developed your own thoughts on the subject further, and these thoughts may be very different to Montaigne's. For example, take one of his essays on human pride. There he argues that pride is a particularly pernicious vice because people who are in the process of improving themselves and potentially becoming more virtuous are particularly susceptible to it. It makes vice something that you can't just work your way out of in a straightforward linear fashion, because any improvement has the potential to grow your pride as well. Nonetheless, Montaigne seems to recommend trying to avoid communicating your own glories as much as possible, listing off various different examples of those who have deliberately done this and received praise as a result. The irony, of course, being that if this was your aim, then you would be avoiding glory just because you're secretly hoping that this will lead to even greater glory. Now, you may not agree with Montaigne, but he becomes a very clever interlocutor for your own thinking and understanding. It helps that he doesn't write in riddles and is pretty easy to get to grips with, so you don't have to worry too much about misinterpreting him. Like any thinker, it is possible to get the wrong end of the stick, but on the whole, Montaigne is a very, very clear writer, and you're just not that likely to get stuck in an interpretive quagmire. My own copy of the essays also has Montaigne's letters and travel journal attached, and while they're less straightforwardly philosophical philosophical, it's just lovely to see how Montaigne observes the world. You get a real sense for his love of Greek and Roman literature and history, since not only does he reference them almost continually in his essays, they feature in his travel journals as well in, I don't know, really sweet ways. At one point, he approaches some Italian peasants to ask them about some finer points of the work of Pliny the Younger, as if he just expects everyone to have read everything that he has, and unsurprisingly, they haven't. I just like little stories like this. They really humanize Montaigne. My copy is the Everyman Classics version, and I also just really like how the pages feel, so yes, would highly recommend. Next up, we have Albert Camus from The Absurd to Revolt by John Foley. This was, if memory serves, actually the very first book that I read at the beginning of this year, and it has completely changed the way I see Camus and his work. Like many people, I had read a lot of Camus' novels and fiction, as well as The Myth of Sisyphus and The Rebel, and sort of didn't know how to reconcile later Camus with early Camus. Whereas the earlier Camus seems basically unconcerned with ethics and values the quantity of life over its quality, and generally puts forward a more stereotypically absurdist outlook, the later Camus seems much more worried about morality and solidarity with our fellow man and valuing all life. It's a little bit less, let's imagine Sisyphus happy, and a bit more, let's face the struggles of the world together. This change even occurs in his heroes, whereas Meursault in The Stranger is ultimately an indifferent murderer. Dr. Rieux in The Plague even manages to stir himself to moral outrage at points, and is certainly not indifferent in the face of pain. He fights against it with all of his being, and ends the novel resigned to remembering the suffering of others so that he can honour them. This can make reading Camus a bit of a bewildering experience. It's as if there are two separate writers battling it out for the soul of Albert. And the topic of Foley's book is reconciling this seeming contradiction within Camus' philosophy and charting the development in his work, hence the title, From the Absurd to Revolt. How does Camus go from merely saying imagine Sisyphus happy to becoming one of the foremost humanists of the mid-20th century? For Foley, this was largely due to two pretty cataclysmic events. The first is the Second World War, and the second is the atrocities committed in the USSR, and specifically how Camus saw people within French academia defend them. Both of these thus shocked Camus out of his general indifference. He could not remain placid in the face of the Nazi menace, nor the atrocious Gulag system. And while Meursault may have shrugged his shoulders at suffering, Camus just couldn't keep this up. It's a pretty understandable shock to the system. I imagine that would change many of our outlooks as well. This caused Camus to try to see what ethics and care you can do within an absurdist framework. Is there room for things like resisting suffering and caring for your fellow human being without taking a dreaded leap of faith into positing an objective meaning for life or objective ethics? Camus thinks that there is, but it is an open question whether he is right. I obviously can't go too much into it here, but I have made a couple of videos about Camus' thought this year, and they do both touch upon the theme of this development. I wanted to recommend this book for a couple of reasons. The first is that the later Camus is just often overshadowed by earlier Camus. The Myth of Sisyphus and The Stranger are, at least in my estimation, more widely read than The Plague and The Rebel, and even fewer people have read some of Camus' bridging works like Caligula or the essay Neither Victims Nor Executioners. This sort of means that our popular picture of Camus is kind of stuck in the first 2-ish years of what was an almost 20-year career. That's a real shame, and Foley's book is a much-needed correction to this. Secondly, we get an absolutely wonderful chapter on the dispute between Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, including how they fell out and why it got so bitter. Foley compares different sources, as well as giving some much-needed skepticism to the reports of Simone de Beauvoir, who, as Sartre's life partner, is obviously something of a biased source. And lastly, there just aren't that many thorough academic books on Camus' work as a philosopher. For a thinker who so captures public imagination, he is often neglected by the academy. This is for a whole host of reasons, including but not limited to his falling out with a lot of French academics and the fact that so much of his lauded work is novelistic in nature. So it's just refreshing to have a really high-quality scholarly work on Camus. And if I'm honest, I think there is so much more room for work in this area. I think that a great PhD thesis would be comparing Nietzsche's work to Camus and seeing what impact he had on his thoughts, but we won't get into any of that here. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. Next up, we have No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. I was, admittedly, a little bit skeptical about this book at first. It had been recommended to me a whole bunch of times, but whenever I looked into it further, it sort of seemed like it would be a little bit edge for the sake of edge, if that makes sense. But I was absolutely monumentally wrong, and if I wore a hat, I would eat it. No Longer Human follows Oba Yozo, a young Japanese man from a fading aristocratic family who just can't learn to connect with or relate to others. He interacts with the world as if he is behind soundproof glass. The exact reasons behind this are only ever hinted at, but the book explores the effects that this sorry state has on Yozo's life and his mental state, and suffice to say, it's not overwhelmingly positive. The title is sometimes translated as Disqualified from Humanity, and it comes from Yozo's feeling that he was just not quite like all the people around him, that he was something lesser and vaguely disgusting. The tone and overall feel reminded me a lot of Kafka's writings, but instead of it being set in an absurd world, it is set in 20th century Japan. I've since read another novel by Dazai called The Setting Sun, and honestly, I think it's a bit of a toss-up between the two novels, which one I personally prefer. There aren't many authors who can be as unrelentingly bleak as Dazai is, yet at the same time not come across as trite, or, as I just said, edgy for the sake of being edgy. And to be honest, if you just had the book described to you, as it was to me, you might think that it is simple voyeurism, but just applied to suffering. But his books so clearly come from such a personal place that they're infused with so many little details of pain that they avoid cliché almost entirely. Instead, you get the personal experience of Dazai himself laser-beamed into your head in exquisite, torturous intricacy. I wouldn't really describe No Longer Human as a pleasant read. It has its moments of levity, but it took me a while to get through it just because it would make me feel quite sad after reading a few chapters. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. If it is the hallmark of a great novel to make you feel, this certainly made me feel. And sure, the feeling it gave me was ennui, but I do think that's probably the intended effect. It also forces you to ask what I think is a vitally important question for each of us. What is authenticity, and what does it mean to be authentic? A lot of Yozo's issues come about because he can't act naturally. He is so terrified of the people around him that he only feels safe interacting with them through a carefully crafted conscious persona. We must ask ourselves to what extent we do the same. Unrestrained authenticity is not necessarily a great thing in all cases, but neither is the kind of extreme self-concealment pursued by Yozo. I'm a complete sucker for questions like this in literature, and amidst all the tragic events, it is the part of the novel that has really stuck with me, especially since, and this may come as a shock, I too am prone to overthinking from time to time. Okay, our next book is The Right to Oblivion by Lowry Presley. Pretty much everyone agrees that privacy is important, but why exactly? Surely if we have nothing to hide, then we have nothing to fear. Presley's book, The Right to Oblivion, is an extremely detailed argument attempting to answer this concern about the importance of privacy, both at the individual level and at the societal one. I have a whole video going through this book in a fair amount of detail, so I'll just give its broad contours here. Essentially, Presley argues that privacy is not about controlling information about you, but instead about ensuring that no information is created in the first place when you are in private. To use his example, say you are staying in a hotel room and somebody spies on you while you're there. You don't do anything that you would not normally be happy for people to see. You might read a book, you watch a bit of telly, and then you go to bed. You never find out about this voyeur, and they never tell anyone what totally unremarkable things they saw. Now, I bet you still think that this situation is undesirable, that it is harmful, but what harm has actually been done? Pressley argues that the harm comes from the creation of facts about what you were doing at that particular time in your hotel room, and how now there is the opportunity for someone to read into your character about it. If no one had watched you, then it would be totally indeterminate what you had done in that time. At the very least, no one could say either way. But since someone was watching you, there are now definite and communicable facts about what you were up to, even if they weren't actually communicated. And even though they are totally unremarkable facts, Pressley argues that their mere existence is a huge part of why we would feel violated in this situation. This is just one of the arguments that Pressley gives. Later in the book, Pressley discusses controversial legal cases, like a man in Germany who was granted the right to be forgotten after he was released from prison for a crime he had committed decades ago. Pressley argues that having information about you die out over time as it becomes less and less relevant to predicting your behavior now and judging your character now is exceptionally important, since it does mean that our personalities in the eyes of other people can't be frozen for all time. We are then given the space and opportunity to change and grow, and for other people's views of us to change and grow with that. However, the kind of unrelenting permanence of the data about us that's stored online presents real problems for this in the future. Will there come a time where there's just no way we could feasibly allow our pasts to be eroded by the sands of time? Pressley thinks this might come to pass, and he views this eventuality as downright dystopian. It's easy to see why. This is a really good book, and it's also incredibly readable. While Pressley does bring in a lot of different philosophers, he's always very clear in introducing their ideas and outlining where they'll be relevant to his own line of argument. It is an academic work of philosophy, but at the same time, it's clear that Pressley has worked very hard to make sure that you don't have to have a strong background in philosophy to understand it. I'm actually a pretty good example of this, since I wasn't familiar with many of the thinkers that Pressley talks about in his book, save for Hannah Arendt and, I guess, Charles Taylor, if we're stretching a little bit, because I don't know him that well. But either way, my point is, I didn't know most of the thinkers that Pressley brought in, but I still found the book enjoyable and understandable. Okay, next up we have Realism for Realistic People by Ha-Seok Chang. So if you've been hanging around the channel for a while, then you'll know that I am a pretty big fan of philosophical pragmatism. I plan to make a whole video on the subject at some point, but one thing about talking about pragmatism is that coming up with a definition of pragmatism is actually pretty hard to pin down. It doesn't help that when someone says pragmatism, a lot of people immediately think of ideas like you should believe whatever's useful in the short term, or the truth is whatever works for you, which are either straw men of what real pragmatists thought, or they just reflect these one or two incredibly controversial lectures that William James gave that probably don't even reflect his own views in their full sophistication. And my favourite aspect of Realism for Realistic People is the simple fact that it tackles these misconceptions about pragmatism pretty much head on, and then defines and explains a much more accommodating form of pragmatic philosophy. I should admit a personal bias here. Ha-Seok Chang supervised me for part of my master's, and in addition to being incredibly clever, he's also a really nice guy. Essentially, Chang argues that we can capture most, if not all, of what we want from realism in philosophy of science, like theory convergence and reliability and stability and solving the so-called no miracles problem, within a pragmatist view instead of a realist one. Chang's thesis here is specifically in the philosophy of science, but his arguments are ultimately applicable to far, far more than just this. Among other things, Chang comes up with the definition of our empirical usage of the word true in terms of maximizing operational coherence, which is the ability of something, be it a theory, a proposition, or otherwise, to perform coherent activities in the world. Or, I should say, facilitate us to perform coherent activities in the world. I can't really summarize Chang's thesis in any minimally adequate way here, so I'll just highlight one particularly perceptive observation. oftentimes in debates around realism and anti-realism, be it in science or ethics or what have you, people assume that under an anti-realist or non-realist position, anything goes, and truth or reality or ethics or anything are just up to each of us subjectively to work out. But Hassock points out that this just doesn't follow. It's perfectly possible to account for the peculiarly human elements of inquiry and so dip your toe into non-realism with merely the concept of mind framing, while explicitly denying any element of mind control and so not having it end up in an anything goes scenario. I feel like I use this example all the time, but let's check out the Wittgenstein duck-rabbit illusion. Some people see this as a rabbit and some people see it as a duck, and you can switch between the two based on your own conceptual framing. How you perceive the duck is mind-framed. However, this doesn't mean that what you perceive is totally mind-controlled. You can't suddenly force yourself to see a gorilla or a banana in this image because our perceptions are not entirely up to us. And that holds whether you are a robust realist or a neo-Kantian or a pragmatist. Aside from his main points, Hassock's book is absolutely filled with these little aha moments, and as I said, they are often relevant to far more than simply philosophy of science. Its observations, really, I would argue, are relevant to philosophy as a whole. In fact, if I were to recommend everyone read one book by a still living philosopher that would fundamentally reorient how they perceive the process of philosophical inquiry, it would probably be this one. Also, as a sort of special mention, I suppose, I also highly recommend this book, which is Cheryl Mizak's Pragmatism from Peirce and James to Ramsey and Wittgenstein. I can't include it on this list as I read it last year, not this year, so it doesn't fit the video. But it is an absolutely fantastic book. It takes you through kind of from the end of the 19th century all the way through to mid-20th century in pragmatist thought, and it is also brilliant for dispelling some of those caricatures about pragmatism that we talked about. Also, anything by Hugh Price is brilliant if you want some modern pragmatist philosophical literature. I just have to get stuck into Richard Rorty until I understand him, and then my full pragmatist awakening will be complete. Next, we have Alexander Nemas's Nietzsche, Life as Literature, although with a bit of a twist. I've always been a real fan of Brian Leiter's interpretations of Friedrich Nietzsche, and he was really, really critical of this book. So for a long time, I was quite hesitant about it, but this year I picked it up for myself, and I actually really enjoyed it. It made me see Nietzsche in a very different light. Nemas's thesis and interpretation is quite complex, but essentially the through line of his thought is that his interpretation of Nietzsche sees life and the world more generally as analogous to a literary text. All of Nietzsche's key ideas, from the will to power to the eternal return and perspectivism, are seen and interpreted through this lens. Nietzsche's project, then, in its kind of normative or therapeutic sense, as it's sometimes put, is seen as providing what he thinks is a truly life-affirming interpretation of the literature of reality, if that makes sense. Now, as I said, Leiter heavily critiques this view for a number of pretty plausible reasons. He says it doesn't do justice to Nietzsche's admiration for contemporary German materialism, nor for his avowed commitment to something at least akin to genuine historical fidelity in works like The Genealogy of Morals. So I'm sort of going to make this a twin recommendation. Although I read Leiter before this year, I'm going to recommend this book as a pair with Brian Leiter's Nietzsche on Morality. The two interpreters work fantastically as sort of contrast media for one another, if that makes sense. And personally, I had quite a lot of fun rereading Nietzsche on Morality while I was reading Nietzsche, Life as Literature, as they naturally form a conversation, despite the fact that this one was written in 1985 and Leiter's was written in 2002. So, I don't know, I can only say that I personally enjoyed that experience. The place where Leiter does praise Nemas's interpretation is in Nemas's treatment of the eternal recurrence, or the eternal return. And I also thought this was probably the strongest and most interesting part of the book, though that could just be Leiter's unconscious influence going into it. Essentially, Nemas sees the eternal recurrence as falling out of Nietzsche's general skepticism about a division between necessary and accidental properties of objects, as well as a view of an object's properties as the sum of their effects on other objects. This means that Nietzsche's view of the world, at least for Nemas, sees everything's relationship with everything else as essential to making the world what it is and making it what it is. And thus, to wish for one part of the world to be different would be to wish for it all to be different. Thus, for Nemas, the eternal recurrence becomes kind of a thought experiment, but it's also reminding the reader that they can't pick and choose parts of reality. If they affirm part of it, then they affirm all of it, and if they reject part of it, then they reject all of it. I don't know if I wholeheartedly agree that this is what Nietzsche meant with the eternal recurrence, but even if it's not, I think it is still an extremely worthwhile philosophical argument in its own right, and I do think that it is, at very least, a quite plausible interpretation of Nietzsche. It essentially allows us to recapture some of the part-whole relationship of other philosophical systems, and especially ancient ones like Stoicism, without positing an overarching telos to the universe. And I think that's interesting in its own right. Another Nietzsche book I wanted to shout out is Nietzsche's System by John Richardson. It's quite a dense book, and I've been reading it quite slowly, but I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, and I'm absolutely loving it so far. Another one from nearer the beginning of the year is Maude Marie Clark's Nietzsche on Truth and Philosophy, which isn't just a good book on Nietzsche's theory of truth, but the second chapter also contains a pretty good survey of lots of 20th century theories of truth more generally. I'm always a big fan of Clark and her work on Nietzsche, and this book has pretty much changed the landscape of how we view Nietzsche's ideas about truth. It kind of made waves in the 90s, so it's worth reading if you are interested in secondary literature on Nietzsche. But anyway, back to Nemas. I would read Nemas's book in conjunction with Leiter's, as seeing where they disagree is in some ways even more valuable than reading them in isolation. They disagree on almost everything, but they each give pretty strong and, I would say, plausible arguments for their view. It's also just nice for elucidating one of the frustrating truths about Nietzsche more generally, that there are a truly astonishing number of plausible readings for his work, and I just think this is generally worth acknowledging when we're reading him, because I know, otherwise I think that we can get very fixed into one particular mode of interpreting Nietzsche and forget that there are plausible alternatives. I've certainly done that with Leiter's general naturalistic interpretation of Nietzsche, for example. Okay, next up we have The Letters to Felice and The Letters to Milena by Franz Kafka. I know that these are two books, but I read them together and they're relatively similar, and I feel like I can talk about them as one book. Each one is a collection of letters from Franz Kafka to women he became entangled with. His two-time fiancée, but no-time wife, Felice Bauer, and Milena Jasenka. Kafka is a surprisingly enigmatic figure, especially given that we know quite a lot about him in terms of bare particular facts. His writings are often full of despair and absurdity and fear, while many of the personal anecdotes we have about him paint him as quite cheerful and upbeat and sociable. But I've often found that it's in his letters that we find the closest bridge between these two pictures of Kafka. His letters to Felice, in particular, really display the full range of his emotional spectrum. One moment he is elated, and we can see that affable, joyous Kafka that Max Brod talks about. But then he'll worry about what Felice thinks of him, or he'll worry about the state of his writings, or just his own abilities, and suddenly he is in despair, and he's wringing his anxious hands over what he should do, and writing endless letters to Felice to seek reassurance from her of her feelings. The Kafka of Joseph K. and Gregor Samsa suddenly re-emerges. I've read a fair bit of Kafka's diaries, and it is remarkable how similar the tone is in his diary entries and his letters. They're both pretty candid concerning his feelings and his desires, and if anything, he sometimes comes across as more vulnerable in his letters. A great many of his diary entries are just quite businesslike. I think my favourite letters are those that deal with Kafka's relationship with writing. Kafka is known for putting himself in his works, but in his letters, it's so clear that his writing means more to him than anything else. Sometimes he even sort of emotionally lashes out at his lovers because he is worried that being with them will tear him away from his work. The letters really are a peek behind the parchment at what made Kafka tick. I don't want to say much more than that because I will go on forever about them, but I reference them a lot in this video if you fancy checking it out. Okay, next up we have Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and also this, which is the Cambridge companion to Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. So I'm kind of cheating with this one because I have read the Meditations before, but I was a teenager and I'd actually barely revisited it since. Marcus Aurelius has sort of a strange place in Stoicism scholarship because, I don't know, in my experience, he just gets a lot less respect than most other thinkers. There's a quote, I think it might actually be from John Sellers, where he says that Marcus Aurelius is seen as something like the unimaginative disciple who somehow got it wrong, which is just a quite funny way of putting it. But that is, in my experience at least, how he is often seen. The Meditations is sometimes held up unfavorably to more sophisticated philosophical texts like Epictetus's Discourses, and is so judged lacking. And personally speaking, I've been guilty of this as well. But on reflection, this is kind of unfair to Aurelius. This is his personal journal, and however we ended up with it, it's unlikely that it was intended by him for publication. So this is like comparing someone's private writings to another person's public polished ones. I'm currently writing a video on the Meditations, so I won't go into too much detail here. In fact, it may end up being the next video that I put out. But when I went back to the Meditations with a careful eye, I was surprised at just how interesting Aurelius's thoughts and reflections were, and specifically how he often melds orthodox Stoic teachings with other philosophers and philosophies that he is clearly quite interested in, like Heraclitus and Plato. And I was also just struck by his, semi-instrumentalist view of philosophy more generally, whereby it is the means through which we achieve a good life, rather than something pursued for the sake of truth or as an end in itself. I'm kind of strawmanning him there, but in a nutshell, I suppose, with the requisite distortions of simplification, that is one of the things that struck me about him. I also did want to give a shout out to the Cambridge companion to the Meditations. I've put it back down, so I'll just get it up again. It was incredibly helpful in helping me see some of the deeper aspects of the Meditations. And after reading the introduction to this, I was determined to give Aurelius another shot. So that was the spur that got me to revisit it. It's got some fantastic essays, and it goes quite deep into the kind of nuances of the original Greek, and it canvasses different ways of interpreting Aurelius's work. The final essay is also really interesting, and it covers the connection between the Meditations and modern psychotherapeutic techniques. The thing I really came to appreciate this time around was viewing the Meditations as less a work of traditional philosophical argumentation and more an attempt to apply philosophy in practice. I know that sounds obvious, but it involves a whole set of different evaluative criteria when we're reading the book. The repetitions and the supposed lack of rigor and the lack of detailed outlines of Stoic principles explained explicitly just makes a lot more sense when we are viewing this as a tool that Marcus was using for essentially bringing his own life and character in line with his principles. And this means that a lot of interesting philosophy is assumed or alluded to rather than outright stated or argued for. But this is probably more in line with what Aurelius was aiming towards. So yes, past me was deeply unfair to Marcus Aurelius, and I have an awful lot more time for him after revisiting him this year. I still wouldn't recommend the Meditations as your first foray into Stoic philosophy because, as I said, a lot of the in-depth Stoic ideas are alluded to rather than explained or argued for, but as like the second book on Stoicism that you read, maybe after Epictetus or maybe just after a general introduction, like a modern academic general introduction, I actually think that this is fantastic. And I know it's not exactly a niche opinion, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations is good, but oh well, I'm just kind of punishing my past self for his rank arrogance. And finally, we have The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I almost don't want to say too much about this book. It is fantastic and horrifying in so many different ways, and I also just don't want to spoil it. On the blurb, it says, "I've done my damnedest to rip a reader's nerves to rags. I don't want him satisfied," which kind of sums it up, to be honest. Like a lot of other of Steinbeck's works, this story is set in and primarily about America in the 1930s, and specifically the impact of the Great Depression on the rural United States. We follow the Joad family as they attempt to escape poverty-stricken Oklahoma for the supposed sunny uplands of California, but when they arrive, they find that they have been sold a false promise. It's sort of a difficult book to read, and that's not because it's badly written. It's written absolutely wonderfully. It's just that it's kind of unrelentingly sad and depressing, and what's more, Steinbeck's really good at getting you to care about characters, so it is just that bit more soul-crushing. But it is because of this that I want to recommend it. Steinbeck pulls absolutely no punches in his descriptions of human misery and poverty and pain. The book made me furious more than once, but it was a good kind of fury, and as a pretty relaxed and quite upbeat guy, it does take a lot to make me upset or angry, so it is a real testament to the book quality that it managed to do that. Again, I just don't know what more to say about the book without giving away some of the main plot points. So I can only really say that it has emotionally affected me more than any other book this year. And if that is not high praise for a novel, then I really don't know what is. Having said that, The Grapes of Wrath is quite a difficult place to start with Steinbeck. The language is just, it's not necessarily the easiest to understand at first read, if that makes sense. It kind of, similar to what we were talking about with McCarthy in the last video, he often meshes a kind of biblical style of language with naturalistic descriptions, and that can make it a little bit confusing at first. It takes a while to settle into. So if you do fancy an easier route into Steinbeck, I would recommend Of Mice and Men. I know that it's assigned in so many schools and almost everyone knows what happens and how it ends, and it's become a bit of a meme, at least in the UK, but it does really get you used to Steinbeck's particular way of writing in a gentler way, which can be, as I said, a little bit unfamiliar if you've not read much of him before. Also, while Of Mice and Men is undeniably heartbreaking, it's a little less gut-wrenchingly brutal than The Grapes of Wrath. So, yeah, those are my favourite books that I have read this year. If you fancy it, then please leave your own list of your favourites as well. I'm always looking for good books to read. If you want to check out some of my other book recommendations, I've got a video on that right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.